caught his maid breastfeeding his child. What he did next surprised everyone. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and write in the comments where you're watching from. Danielle Harper had grown used to waking before dawn. Her small apartment on the south side of the city was silent at that hour, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional cry of her neighbor's baby through the thin walls. She moved carefully through the darkened space, her body attuned to this routine after years of early morning shifts. Today was no different. She poured herself a cup of coffee, black because milk was too much of a luxury, and glanced at the clock on the wall. It was barely 5:30. She pulled her hair into a neat bun and slipped into her uniform, a simple gray polo shirt embroidered with the name of the company contracted to clean one of the city's most prestigious high-rise towers. Danielle had worked as a janitor there for nearly 4 years, balancing long shifts with her responsibilities as a single mother. Her daughter, Maya, just 6 years old, was still asleep in the room they shared. Danielle stood at the doorway for a moment, watching her small chest rise and fall, clutching the frayed stuffed rabbit she'd carried since she was a baby. It was Maya who kept her going. Everything Danielle did, the double shifts, the skipped meals, the relentless exhaustion, was for her. The child deserved better than what life had handed them, and Danielle would stop at nothing to give her a chance at something more. She placed a gentle kiss on her daughter's forehead before pulling the door shut softly and stepping out into the cool pre-dawn air. The city was just beginning to stir as she boarded the early bus to downtown. Through the fogged-up windows, Danielle watched as the glittering skyline grew closer. Among the towers that pierced the sky, one stood out. The Whitaker Building, named after its owner, Jonathan Whitaker, a name Danielle had heard whispered countless times in articles or on the evening news. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, a tech magnate whose empire had transformed the city. To Danielle, though, he was little more than a distant figurehead. She doubted he even knew her name. The bus ride ended, and soon she was inside the building's service entrance, trading nods with other members of the staff. Most of them were like her, invisible to the building's residents, gliding through the background while executives in sharp suits and polished shoes passed them by without a glance. Danielle clocked in and gathered her supplies, bracing herself for another long morning of cleaning office floors that would sparkle in time for their high-profile occupants to arrive. The top floor of the tower was reserved exclusively for Whitaker himself. Danielle had only been there a handful of times, always early in the morning when the floor was empty, silent, and gleaming with wealth. She remembered the first time she'd stepped inside his private office, the panoramic view of the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls, the elegant furniture that seemed plucked from a design magazine, and the faint scent of expensive cologne that lingered in the air even in his absence. It felt like a different world, one she didn't belong in, and yet she found herself there again today, mop and cleaning cart in tow. She worked quietly, as always, moving methodically through the space. It was only as she approached the private lounge adjoining his office that she heard it, a faint whimper, soft and plaintive. Danielle froze, heart pounding. No one was supposed to be here at this hour. Cautiously, she followed the sound and peered around the corner. There, in a small crib tucked beside the couch, lay a baby. He couldn't have been more than 6 months old, red-faced and squirming, his cries weak but insistent. Danielle blinked, stunned. What was a baby doing here? She set her mop aside and glanced around. The room was empty, silent but for the child's fussing. She looked down at him again, noting the bottle lying untouched beside him, its contents still full. Her instincts took over before reason could intervene. She'd been a mother long enough to recognize the signs: hunger, discomfort, the desperate way his tiny fists opened and closed. Without thinking, she scooped him up gently, rocking him against her shoulder. He quieted almost instantly, bearing his tear-streaked face into her neck. Danielle hesitated, her heart clenching. This wasn't her child. She had no right. But leaving him alone felt impossible. She glanced at the bottle, then back at the baby, who let out another small whine. With a steadying breath, she cradled him and tried the bottle. He turned his head away, rejecting it. She frowned. She'd seen this before. Maya had done the same when she was this age, refusing anything that wasn't nursing. The realization settled in her stomach like a stone. She bit her lip, torn. She knew what he needed. She knew she could soothe him, that it would only take a few minutes. Her body still produced milk for Maya, though her daughter was well past infancy, and Danielle had kept nursing longer than most because it comforted her little girl during the stressful nights. Her mind raced. This was insane. Crossing this line could cost her everything if anyone found out. But then the baby whimpered again, louder this time, his tiny fists trembling. Danielle's resolve broke. She shifted him carefully, her movements automatic, natural. The baby latched instantly, and within seconds his cries faded into soft, contented suckles. Relief washed over Danielle like a wave. She held him close, her hand stroking the back of his downy head, whispering soothing words. The room was silent again, filled only with the rhythm of his feeding and the steady thrum of her own heartbeat. Time blurred. She didn't hear the door open behind her. Jonathan Whitaker had returned from his early meeting unexpectedly, his mind occupied with figures and deadlines. He stepped into his office quietly, loosening his tie, only to stop dead in his tracks at the sight before him. Danielle didn't see him at first. She was too focused on the infant in her arms, the tenderness etched across her face unmistakable. Jonathan stared, frozen as he processed the image. His son, nestled securely against the chest of a woman he barely recognized, one of the cleaning staff, he realized after a beat. It should have enraged him. It should have felt like an intrusion. But instead, something unexpected stirred in him. There was a serenity in the scene, a warmth that felt almost sacred. His son, usually so fussy and restless, looked peaceful, utterly content in her arms. Jonathan felt a sharp pang deep in his chest, a mix of confusion and something else he hadn't felt in years. When Danielle finally noticed him, she gasped, freezing in place as if she'd been caught stealing. The baby stirred but didn't cry, still clinging to her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick with tension. Jonathan's gaze met hers, searching, unreadable. In that instant, Danielle felt her world tilt. She didn't know if she would be fired, arrested, or worse. All she knew was that nothing would ever be the same after this moment. For a moment, the silence between them seemed unbearable. Danielle stood frozen, unable to move, her breath shallow and quick. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, her arms trembling slightly as she held the baby closer out of instinct, as if shielding him from what was coming next. Jonathan Whitaker stepped forward, his face unreadable, his gaze fixed on her. His presence filled the room effortlessly, commanding in a way that made Danielle feel suddenly small and exposed. She began, but her voice failed her. There was no explanation she could offer that would make sense. What could she possibly say? That she had heard his child crying and acted on instinct? That she hadn't thought of consequences, only of comfort? Every possible defense sounded hollow in her mind. Jonathan stopped just a few feet away, his eyes lowering briefly to his son, still nestled against Danielle's chest, quiet and content. That sight struck him harder than he expected. His son had never been this calm for him. Not once. He could count on one hand the number of times the baby had relaxed like this without fussing endlessly. Seeing it now, a stranger holding him so tenderly, so naturally, unnerved him. "Put him down," Jonathan said finally, his voice low but steady. Danielle's breath caught. She nodded quickly, almost fumbling as she gently shifted the baby back toward his crib. The child stirred slightly but didn't cry, his tiny hand gripping Danielle's finger until she eased him down onto the mattress. She lingered for a moment, brushing a soft hand over his cheek, then stepped back as though retreating from a fire. Jonathan's eyes followed her every move. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't shouted or accused her, but there was something in his controlled demeanor that made Danielle's stomach twist with dread. She clasped her hands together to keep them from shaking, struggling to find her words. "I'm so sorry," she said finally, her voice quiet but urgent. "I heard him crying, and I didn't think anyone was here. I only wanted to help." Jonathan didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his attention back to the baby. For several seconds, he simply watched his son, then exhaled deeply and looked back at Danielle. "Help?" he repeated, his tone even but laced with curiosity. "Is that what you call this?" Danielle flinched at the words, heat rising in her cheeks. "I know how it looks," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I swear I wasn't trying to overstep. He was so upset, and I just acted without thinking." Jonathan studied her, his expression inscrutable. His sharp gaze lingered on her face, her uniform, the way she carried herself. Modest, deferential, but with a trace of strength that hadn't gone unnoticed. Most people cowered before him when they feared they'd made a mistake. Danielle didn't cower. She simply looked stricken, remorseful, but there was no trace of deceit. He sighed quietly, rubbing the bridge of his nose with his thumb and forefinger. He hadn't planned to be here this morning, and yet here he was, staring at a woman he barely knew who had managed to do what even his team of nannies couldn't. His son looked peaceful. For the first time since his wife's death, Jonathan felt a flicker of something he couldn't define. "Do you have children?" he asked suddenly, his voice quieter this time. Danielle blinked at the unexpected question. "Yes," she answered softly. "A daughter. She's 6. Jonathan nodded slowly, as if that explained something. He looked at her again, really looked, and noticed the faint exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands were calloused from long days of work, and the quiet steadiness in her demeanor. She was not the type of woman who took risk lightly, he realized, which meant that whatever had compelled her to do what she'd done had been instinctive, not calculated. "Sit," he said abruptly, gesturing toward the chair by his desk. Danielle hesitated, unsure if this was an order or a trap, but she obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair as if ready to spring back to her feet. Jonathan moved behind his desk, leaning against it rather than sitting, his arms folded. "I should fire you," he said, his tone devoid of anger but firm nonetheless. Danielle's stomach dropped, and she clenched her hands together to keep them steady. "I understand," she murmured. "But," he continued, surprising her, "I'm not going to. Not yet." Her head snapped up, eyes wide. "Sir?" Jonathan's expression remained steady. "You calmed him," he said simply, nodding toward the crib. "No one else can do that. Not the nannies I've hired, not even me half the time. And you, he gestured toward her with a slight motion of his hand. You walked in here, and somehow he's quiet, peaceful. How? Danielle swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. I've been through it before, she said softly. My daughter was colicky as a baby. Sometimes nothing else worked. I suppose I just knew what to do. Jonathan's gaze didn't waver, and Danielle felt the weight of it. There was something unsettling about the way he studied her, as though he were examining not just her actions but her character, peeling back layers she didn't even realize were visible. Finally, he spoke again. I want you to stay, he said. Danielle frowned. Stay? Not just as part of the cleaning staff, Jonathan clarified. I want you closer to him, my son. The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Danielle's heart skipped. She hadn't anticipated this, hadn't anticipated anything beyond escaping this room with her job intact. Sir, You can refuse, Jonathan interrupted, his tone even. But I think we both know you have a way with him. I'll compensate you properly, more than what you earn now. But in exchange, I expect discretion. What happened this morning doesn't leave this room. Danielle hesitated, torn between caution and an unspoken tug in her chest. The thought of being near that child, of holding him again, of helping in some small way, it stirred something deep in her, the same instinct that had driven her to comfort him in the first place. But there was danger here too. She knew it. Nothing about this offer was simple. Jonathan studied her reaction, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was a man accustomed to reading people, to gauging their motives, and yet Danielle seemed different from anyone else he'd met in years, unguarded, genuine in a way that unsettled him. After a long pause, Danielle nodded faintly. If it helps him, she said quietly, then I'll do it. Jonathan's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. Good, he said, his voice quiet. Then we'll start tomorrow. Danielle rose slowly from the chair, her hands still trembling, and glanced once more at the baby in the crib. He was sleeping soundly now, oblivious to the strange new bond forming in this room. As she left his office, Danielle couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn she couldn't yet understand. She had walked in this morning expecting nothing more than another routine shift. Instead, she had stepped into a world that was not her own, a world of quiet wealth and untouchable power, and somehow been invited closer. Jonathan remained by his desk long after she had gone, his eyes fixed on his son, still asleep. There was something about Danielle Harper he couldn't ignore, something he wasn't ready to name. For the first time in a long while, he felt a curiosity he hadn't expected. And deep down, beneath his cool composure, he also felt a spark of something else. Trust. The following morning felt different for Danielle, though she couldn't quite explain why. Her daughter, Lily, had noticed her distracted expression over breakfast and asked in her small, curious voice if something was wrong. But Danielle had only smiled and kissed the top of her head. Nothing's wrong, baby, she'd said softly, though even she wasn't sure she believed it. Something had changed inside her after the conversation with Jonathan Whitaker the previous day. The weight of his words lingered, echoing in her mind as she walked to the bus stop in the pale morning light. She had agreed to his offer. It had been instinctive, almost reflexive, but the reality of it was now sinking in. No longer was she just a cleaning woman passing silently through the halls of his mansion, invisible to everyone but the other staff. She had been given proximity, closer access to his world, to his child, and with it came a sense of both apprehension and something far less familiar. purpose. When she arrived at the estate, the atmosphere felt subtly altered. The house was quieter than usual, the staff moving efficiently, but casting curious glances in her direction as though they knew something had shifted. Danielle felt those eyes on her, whispers brushing past her like faint winds she couldn't catch. She clutched her cleaning supplies closer to her chest and walked steadily down the polished corridor toward the nursery, the echo of her footsteps unnervingly loud in the otherwise muted house. Jonathan was already there when she entered, standing near the window with his son cradled against his chest. Morning sunlight poured through the tall glass panes, framing him in a glow that made him seem impossibly composed, every inch the powerful man she had always imagined him to be. Yet, what caught Danielle's attention wasn't his commanding posture, but the faint awkwardness in the way he held the baby. His hands were careful, tentative almost, as if afraid of doing something wrong. "You're here," he said, glancing up at her. His tone was even, neutral, but there was something in his eyes that seemed to study her more than his words let on. "Yes, sir," Danielle replied, her voice quieter than she intended. Jonathan nodded once and stepped forward, offering the baby to her. "Take him." She hesitated for only a moment before reaching out. The instant she gathered the child in her arms, he relaxed, a soft coo escaping his lips as he nestled into her shoulder. Danielle felt her chest tighten in that familiar maternal ache. There was something so profoundly vulnerable in this tiny boy, so much trust in the way he clung to her without question. Jonathan noticed the transformation immediately. His son's body softened, his tiny fists unclenching as his head rested against Danielle's neck. Jonathan's brow furrowed slightly, not in displeasure, but in quiet observation. "It's remarkable," he murmured, almost to himself. "He never does that for anyone else." Danielle shifted the baby gently, rocking him in a slow rhythm that came as naturally to her as breathing. "Sometimes," she said softly, "they just need to feel safe. It's not anything extraordinary." Jonathan's gaze flickered to her, sharp and assessing. "Extraordinary or not," he said, "it's effective." They stood there for a moment in silence, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves outside the window and the baby's quiet breaths. Danielle felt the weight of Jonathan's scrutiny, though not in a way that made her recoil. Instead, it was as if he was trying to understand something about her, something she wasn't even sure she understood herself. "Follow me," Jonathan said abruptly, turning toward the door. She hesitated but obeyed, still holding the baby securely in her arms. He led her through the house, past rooms she had only glimpsed in passing. The deeper they went, the more she realized how little she had truly seen of this world despite working here for over a year. Ornate halls stretched before her, lined with artwork she couldn't name, and furniture that looked too fine to touch. Finally, they reached his study. It was a large, imposing room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. Jonathan gestured for her to sit in a chair opposite his desk while he moved behind it. The baby stirred slightly but remained calm in her arms, his tiny fingers clutching at the fabric of her uniform. Jonathan rested his hands on the desk, leaning forward slightly. "I want to be clear about something," he said. His voice carried the steady authority of someone used to being obeyed, but there was a faint trace of sincerity beneath it. "This arrangement isn't casual. You will be compensated for additional duties beyond your usual work, but in exchange, I expect you to prioritize his care whenever I request it." Danielle nodded slowly. "I understand." He studied her for a moment longer. "Do you?" he pressed, his gaze intense. "This isn't just about feeding or holding him. It's about trust. If I'm going to allow you this level of closeness, I need to know I can rely on you completely. My son is all I have left." There was a heaviness in his words that struck Danielle unexpectedly. She had heard whispers from other staff about Jonathan's wife's passing, but hearing it from him, even indirectly, felt different. His tone carried something she hadn't anticipated. Grief, quiet and restrained, buried beneath the layers of his carefully maintained composure. Danielle's grip on the baby tightened just slightly, a protective instinct flaring. "You can trust me," she said quietly. "I don't take that lightly." Jonathan held her gaze for several long seconds before nodding once, seemingly satisfied. "Good," he said, his voice softer now. "Then we'll see how this goes." The days that followed unfolded in ways Danielle hadn't expected. Each morning, she found herself summoned to the nursery or Jonathan's study, always with the baby waiting for her. It became routine. Arriving early, holding the child, soothing his cries, feeding him when Jonathan was tied up in meetings. Slowly, subtly, the mansion began to feel less intimidating. The staff, once wary of her sudden closeness to their employer, grew accustomed to the sight of her carrying the baby through the halls. Jonathan's demeanor shifted too, though in ways so small they were almost imperceptible. At first, he remained reserved, distant, his words clipped and his manner formal. But as days passed, he lingered more often when she was with his son, asking quiet questions about her methods, about how she seemed to calm the baby so effortlessly. One afternoon, he stood in the doorway of the nursery, arms folded as he watched Danielle cradle the child. "He responds to you like he does to no one else," Jonathan said, his voice thoughtful. "It's as if he knows you." Danielle glanced at him, her brow faintly furrowed. "Babies sense warmth," she replied. "They don't care about status or appearances. They just know when someone loves them." Jonathan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, as if the word love had caught him off guard. He didn't reply, only looked at her a moment longer before stepping into the room and joining her by the crib. Their conversations remained brief, often practical, but there was a growing ease in them, a quiet familiarity that neither of them acknowledged outright. For Danielle, it was strange and disorienting, finding herself not just in his home, but in his confidence. And yet, despite her caution, there was a part of her that felt drawn in by it. Late one evening, after her shift had ended, Danielle lingered in the nursery longer than usual. Jonathan stood nearby, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up after a long day. The baby slept soundly in his crib, the room bathed in the soft glow of the night lamp. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You've done more for him in these few days than anyone else has since he was born," Jonathan said quietly, almost to himself. "I'm not sure I've ever thanked you for that." Danielle turned to look at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "He's a good baby. He just needs someone to be there for him." Jonathan met her gaze, and for the briefest instant, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of understanding, of shared recognition. Neither moved, neither spoke further, but the moment lingered in the air, heavier than words could carry. Danielle left shortly after, her thoughts tangled. As she walked home beneath the dim street lights, she couldn't shake the image of Jonathan standing there, softer than she had ever seen him, the quiet vulnerability in his eyes. Something was changing between them, subtle and unacknowledged, but undeniable all the same. The following weeks unfolded with a quiet rhythm that Danielle had not known in years. Each morning began the same way. A hurried breakfast with Lily, the two of them sitting at the small, wobbly kitchen table in their cramped apartment, followed by the long bus ride to the Whitaker estate. Yet, even in its predictability, something felt different now. The mansion, once an intimidating place where she moved like a shadow, was beginning to feel strangely familiar. She still carried her cleaning supplies each day, still performed her duties with diligence, but more and more, her time was spent in the nursery or in the sunlit corners of the house where Jonathan's son gurgled happily in her arms. It was a subtle but profound shift. The staff had grown used to seeing her cradling the child as she walked the halls, her presence no longer sparking whispers, but instead nods of acknowledgement. Even Jonathan's interactions with her had changed. He still carried himself with that reserved, composed air of authority, but he no longer kept his distance. He lingered more often during feedings, watching with a quiet intensity that made Danielle feel simultaneously scrutinized and oddly reassured. One late afternoon, as golden light filtered through the high windows of the nursery, Danielle sat in the rocking chair with the baby nestled against her chest, humming softly. Jonathan stood nearby, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the child. He didn't speak at first, and Danielle didn't press him. She had come to recognize these silences of his, moments when words seemed unnecessary, when presence itself was enough. "He's different with you," Jonathan said finally, his voice low but certain. "I've noticed it more and more, the way he quiets the moment you pick him up. It's like he feels—" He hesitated as if searching for the right word, then settled on safe. Danielle glanced up at him, her expression soft. "Babies know when they're cared for," she replied gently. "It's not complicated. They don't see status or wealth. They just feel who's there for them." Jonathan's eyes lingered on her a moment longer, as though weighing her words. There was something almost vulnerable in his expression, a fleeting glimpse beneath the composed exterior he maintained so carefully. That evening marked the beginning of a new pattern. Jonathan began inviting Danielle to stay later under the guise of needing extra help with the baby during his late business calls. It was always framed practically, but Danielle sensed there was more to it than that. Their conversations, once strictly limited to the child, began to stretch beyond him. Jonathan would ask about her day, about Lily, about small details of her life he had never inquired about before. One night, after a particularly long day, Danielle found herself in the kitchen, helping to prepare a bottle when Jonathan walked in. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and for once he looked less like the untouchable billionaire she had always known him to be, and more like an ordinary man returning home tired from work. He poured himself a glass of water, glanced at her, and for the first time, there was an ease in his voice when he spoke. "You're good with him," he said simply, nodding toward the nursery down the hall. Danielle smiled faintly. "I've had practice," she replied. "Lily was fussy when she was his age. Nothing settled her except being held. Sometimes that's all it takes." Jonathan leaned against the counter, studying her thoughtfully. "It must not have been easy," he said quietly. She looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. "No," she admitted after a pause, "but you do what you have to. There's no other choice." Jonathan didn't press further, but the weight of his gaze remained. There was something in it, a quiet respect, an understanding that felt deeper than words. The days blurred into one another, and slowly, Jonathan began to open up in ways that surprised her. Late at night, after the baby was asleep, He would sometimes linger in the nursery, speaking in a low voice that carried the weariness of someone who had been holding too much inside for too long. He told her about his wife, not in detail, never with flourish, but in fragments that revealed more than he realized. How she had died suddenly, leaving him adrift with an infant he hadn't known how to comfort. How his grief had hardened him, burying him in work as a way to keep from drowning in it. Danielle listened without judgment, offering only the quiet assurance of her presence. She never pried, never asked more than he gave, and perhaps it was that restraint, that simple willingness to let him speak without interruption, that drew him closer. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Jonathan stood by the crib watching his son sleep. Danielle was beside him, tidying up the nursery. The silence between them was steady, comfortable, broken only by Jonathan's voice. "Sometimes I wonder," he said softly, almost as if to himself, "if he'll even remember her, if he'll grow up knowing she loved him." Danielle paused, glancing at him. "He will," she said firmly, "because you'll make sure he does. Children feel those things. Even if they don't remember details, they carry the love they're given." Jonathan turned to her then, his expression unreadable for a long moment. But in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen before, a flicker of trust, raw and unguarded. It was in that moment Danielle realized how much had changed between them. What had started as an arrangement rooted in practicality was becoming something else entirely, something far more personal. She could feel it in the way he lingered near her now, in the softened tone of his voice when he spoke to her, in the unspoken understanding that passed between them when their eyes met. Still, she was cautious. She reminded herself of the gulf between their worlds. He was a man of wealth and power, she a single mother working long hours just to keep the lights on. It would be foolish to imagine anything beyond what they shared now. And yet, despite her caution, she couldn't deny the quiet warmth that stirred in her chest whenever he was near. That warmth deepened one evening when Lily visited the estate for the first time. It was a Saturday, and Jonathan had suggested Danielle bring her along since she couldn't find a sitter. Danielle had been nervous, unsure how her daughter would fit into the pristine world of the mansion, but Jonathan's easy reassurance put her at ease. Lily was instantly enchanted by the house's grandeur, her small voice echoing in awe as she walked through the halls. Jonathan surprised Danielle by kneeling down to Lily's level, greeting her with a gentle smile that melted away his usual reserve. "You must be Lily," he said warmly, offering his hand. "Your mom tells me you're very clever." Lily grinned shyly, her fingers curling into his. It was a small moment, but Danielle felt her breath catch. Seeing him interact with her daughter, not as a distant employer but as someone genuinely kind, did something to her heart she hadn't anticipated. That afternoon, they spent hours together in the garden. Lily played with Jonathan's son while Danielle sat nearby, watching as Jonathan joined in, his laughter low but genuine. It was the first time she had seen him so unguarded, the weight of his grief momentarily lifted. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt like they were something more than employer and employee, as though they belonged together in this strange, fragile balance they had created. But as the sun set and Danielle prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the unease tugging at her thoughts. This closeness, this fragile harmony, it was precarious. She could feel it like a thread stretched taut, ready to snap. Jonathan walked them to the door, his son cradled in his arms. As Danielle stepped out into the cool evening air, he lingered for a moment. "Thank you," he said quietly, his gaze holding hers. "For everything. for being here." Danielle nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "Good night, Mr. Whitaker." But as she walked away, Lily's hand in hers, she couldn't ignore the truth rising within her. This was no longer just about the baby. Something deeper was forming, and she didn't know how much longer she could pretend otherwise. The days that followed seemed almost suspended in an unspoken, delicate balance, as though Danielle and Jonathan had stumbled into a world that neither had intended, but neither wished to leave. The easy rhythm of her routine continued, the soft weight of his infant son in her arms a familiar comfort. Yet beneath it all there was a subtle tension building, one she could sense even if she couldn't name it. For every quiet moment of trust they shared, there was an awareness creeping in at the edges, like a shadow lengthening as evening approaches. Jonathan remained attentive, his demeanor toward her warmer and more open than it had ever been. He was no longer just her employer in the detached sense he once had been. He lingered longer in her presence, his glances holding hers for beats too long to be casual. Danielle found herself watching him in turn, noticing things she never had before. The way his expression softened when he looked at his son, the hint of weariness that touched his features after long workdays, the restrained gentleness in his voice when he spoke to her. But though these moments filled her with a quiet, conflicted warmth, they also stirred unease. She'd always kept her life simple, contained, safe in its predictability despite its hardships. And now she was standing on unfamiliar ground, drawn into a closeness that felt as dangerous as it did comforting. The first ripple of trouble came not from within, but from outside. It began with the glances. A few of the staff who had always kept a polite but indifferent distance started watching her differently. At first, she told herself she was imagining it. The sideways looks in the hallway, the subtle hush in conversation when she entered a room, but it was impossible to deny for long. Whispers have a way of growing in houses with walls as echoing as the Whitaker estate. One afternoon, while tidying up the study, Danielle overheard two maids speaking in low voices in the hall just beyond the door. "She's here later and later," one murmured, her tone sharp with suggestion. "I've seen it too," the other replied. "Always in the nursery, always with him nearby. You don't think—" Their words cut off abruptly as they noticed Danielle's shadow under the door, and by the time she stepped into the hall they had scattered, their smiles too tight, their voices suddenly too bright. Danielle didn't confront them. She had no interest in stoking gossip, but the unease settled deep in her stomach. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on her work and the quiet, steady routine she'd built around the baby. But rumors are like smoke. Even when unseen, you can smell them in the air. They hung there, faint but persistent, threading through the halls of the mansion until even Jonathan seemed to sense them. He was the one who finally addressed it in his own way. It was late one evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, and Danielle was rocking his son gently in the nursery when he stepped inside. His expression was tighter than usual, his jaw set in a way she'd learned to recognize as frustration. "Have you heard it too?" he asked suddenly, without preamble. She looked up at him, startled. "Heard what?" He exhaled slowly, leaning against the doorframe. "The talk. The ridiculous nonsense they've been whispering." Danielle hesitated. She wanted to tell him she hadn't, to downplay it, but lying to him felt impossible. "A little," she admitted quietly. "I don't pay it any mind." Jonathan's gaze hardened slightly, though not at her. "You shouldn't have to," he said firmly. "This is my house. If anyone here thinks they can disrespect you—" "Jonathan," she interrupted softly, more out of instinct than thought, using his first name without realizing it. "It doesn't matter." Really, people will talk no matter what they see. I can handle it." Her voice was calm, but inside she felt a flicker of panic at how casually his anger rose on her behalf, at the intimacy that slipped so easily between them now. It was dangerous, she thought, for both of them. He stared at her for a long moment, then crossed the room slowly, his steps quiet against the plush carpet. He stopped only a foot away, his gaze dropping briefly to his sleeping son before returning to her. "You've done more for him than anyone else since—" He trailed off, as if catching himself, then shook his head. "They don't see it. They don't see how much he needs you." Danielle's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to tell him she understood, that she was only doing what anyone would do for a child who needed love. But the words tangled in her throat because she knew deep down it wasn't just about the baby anymore. Not for him. Not for her. The next few days blurred together, marked by a tension that seemed to hum beneath every glance and every silence between them. And then came the incident that set everything alight. It was a Wednesday evening, nearing dusk, when Danielle stayed later than usual once again. She had been helping Jonathan settle the baby for the night, her usual departure delayed by the lingering quiet moments they shared afterward. As she finally prepared to leave, walking down the long marble hallway toward the grand entrance, she didn't notice the two staff members who lingered nearby, their eyes following her with open suspicion. The next morning, she felt it. The air in the mansion was different, thick with something unspoken. The whispers were louder now, no longer subtle. Even as she moved about her work, she caught snippets, half-heard phrases, murmurs cut off when she entered a room. And then, midway through the day, she was summoned to Jonathan's study. He was waiting for her behind his desk, his expression composed but edged with irritation. "I had to dismiss 2 of them this morning," he said without preamble. Danielle blinked. "Dismiss?" "They were spreading things that have no place in this house," he said sharply. "I won't have it. Not about you. Not about us." The word hung there. Us. Heavy and undeniable. Danielle's breath caught, but Jonathan didn't back away from it. If anything, he seemed more resolute, his gaze unwavering. "This is going to stop," he continued. "I won't let their nonsense touch you." Danielle opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling for words. "Jonathan," she said finally, her voice low, "I never wanted to cause trouble. Maybe I should—" "No." The firmness in his tone silenced her instantly. He stood then, stepping around the desk, closing the distance between them until she could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the sharp clarity in his eyes. "You're not going anywhere. Do you understand me?" Her heart pounded in her chest, but she nodded. She could feel the shift happening, undeniable now, the ground beneath them changing shape. Whatever lines had once existed were blurred beyond recognition, erased by quiet trust, by whispered confidences in the stillness of the nursery, by the unspoken need that tethered them closer with each passing day. As she left his study that evening, Danielle knew things could not stay suspended like this forever. Something was coming, whether they were ready or not. The mansion felt quieter than usual the following morning, though not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, as if every sound had been muted under the strain of what had transpired the day before. Danielle arrived early, as she always did, stepping into the cool marble foyer with her head lowered, her mind looping endlessly over Jonathan's words, how firmly he had spoken, how the word "us" had lingered between them. It had been a line crossed without ceremony, without even a moment to question it. She felt it in her chest like the echo of a bell, resonant and inescapable. She moved through her routine almost mechanically, tending to the baby first, holding him close against her shoulder as his small fingers curled tightly in the fabric of her blouse. He had grown so attached to her presence that even the staff had stopped questioning why he settled only in her arms. The rhythm of rocking him was familiar, grounding, but even that couldn't keep her thoughts from straying to Jonathan. He entered the nursery quietly, his footsteps soft against the rug. Danielle didn't see him at first, too focused on humming softly to the baby, but she felt his presence before she heard his voice. "He sleeps better with you than with anyone else," Jonathan said, his tone softer than she expected. Danielle looked up, startled slightly by his sudden appearance, though not displeased. "He just needs comfort," she replied. "He misses having someone close." Jonathan stepped closer, his gaze settling not on his son but on her. "So do I." The words hung there, heavier than anything he had said before, stripping away whatever remained of the pretense they had clung to. Danielle's heart thudded loudly in her ears, and though she told herself she should turn away, put distance between them, she didn't move. Instead, she held his gaze, steady but uncertain, her arms instinctively tightening around the baby as though anchoring herself. Jonathan reached out gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was fleeting, careful, but it sent a shiver through her that she couldn't disguise. In that moment, something between them shifted irreversibly, and she knew it. But before either of them could speak further, a knock on the door broke the stillness. One of the senior staff entered, her expression stiff and formal. "Mr. Whitaker," she began, glancing briefly at Danielle before continuing, "there's a matter that needs your attention. Urgently." Jonathan's jaw tightened, irritation flashing briefly across his face, but he nodded and turned to Danielle. "I'll be back," he said quietly, his hand lingering a moment longer near hers before he left. The interruption was enough to shake Danielle from the trance she had felt herself slipping into. Alone again in the nursery, she sat down slowly with the baby still in her arms, her mind spinning. She couldn't deny the truth anymore. She was no longer just the housekeeper who cared for the child out of duty or kindness. Her presence had become entwined in their lives in ways that felt permanent and dangerous. That afternoon, as she moved through her tasks, the whispers among the staff intensified, sharper and bolder now. One maid muttered just loud enough for Danielle to hear as she passed, her voice dripping with accusation. "No wonder she's always around. She knows what she's doing." Danielle clenched her jaw, choosing silence over confrontation, but her cheeks burned with humiliation. She wanted to defend herself, to insist they didn't understand, but deep down, she wondered if perhaps they did see more than she wished to admit. By evening, Jonathan returned to the nursery once more, looking weary but determined. "I've had enough," he said simply, his voice low but resolute. "I won't have you treated this way, not in my home." Danielle hesitated. "Jonathan, maybe it's better if—" "No." His interruption was immediate, unyielding. "You're staying. I don't care what anyone says. They don't get to dictate this." His words settled over her like a command and a comfort all at once. The walls she had built for herself, the quiet discipline she had lived by for years, felt as though they were crumbling faster than she could stop them. That night, after the baby was asleep, Danielle lingered longer than usual. She found herself sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she didn't remember making. The mansion was quiet, the rest of the staff gone, and the stillness felt different now, closer, more intimate. When Jonathan entered, he didn't speak right away. He simply sat across from her, studying her with a look that was neither casual nor hesitant. "I don't want you to feel like you have to leave," he said finally, his voice softer now. "You belong here, Danielle." The sincerity in his tone unraveled something deep within her. She looked at him, at the man who had once been only a distant, unreachable figure, and now sat before her as though he had always been waiting. Slowly, she set her mug down and folded her hands in her lap. "I don't know what this is becoming," she admitted quietly, her voice trembling, "but I can't ignore it anymore." Jonathan reached across the table, his hand covering hers, warm and steady. "Neither can I," he replied. In that quiet kitchen, with the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between them, the final barrier dissolved. There was no grand gesture, no sudden rush, just a quiet understanding, an inevitability they had both stopped fighting. Over the next weeks, their bond deepened in ways both subtle and profound. Danielle's care for the baby became an extension of her care for Jonathan, and in turn, he treated her with a tenderness that defied their former roles. The staff noticed the change, but no one dared to speak openly anymore. Jonathan's dismissal of those who spread gossip had silenced the worst of it, though the undercurrents remained. Danielle, however, no longer felt the same sting from their whispers. Her focus had shifted entirely. She belonged here now, not just as an employee, but as someone irreplaceable in their lives. The baby responded to her more than ever, his small giggles lighting up even Jonathan's most stressful days. They began spending evenings together after the child was asleep, talking softly in the dim glow of the living room. Jonathan shared stories of his late wife for the first time, his voice tinged with sorrow and gratitude alike, and Danielle listened with quiet empathy, never pushing, simply offering the solace of her presence. What had begun as a fleeting act of kindness, feeding a crying infant when no one else was there, had grown into something vast and unexpected, weaving Danielle irrevocably into the fabric of their lives. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the house filled with a warm, golden glow, Jonathan stood beside her at the window, watching his son sleep peacefully in her arms. He turned to her, his voice low but sure. "You've given us something I didn't think we'd ever have again," he said. "A home." Danielle's breath caught at his words, a soft ache swelling in her chest. She realized then that this was no longer just about the mansion or even the job she had once come here to do. This was her place now, her family, in a way she hadn't dared to dream. And for the first time in a long while, she felt truly seen. Not as a housekeeper, not as someone passing through a life far grander than her own, but as someone essential, someone chosen. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories, and share this video with your friends.